Hi, I'm Gilly Bond, a specialist pelvic health physio, and I'm answering your questions about bladder pain syndrome. I'm going to talk about what bladder pain syndrome is. So hopefully you have just watched the videos that talk about the difference between what we call IC and BPS, being that they are vaguely the same thing, but our understanding of what those things mean is different now. So what is bladder pain syndrome? Well, we know that there are changes at the level of the bladder, and there are changes in the areas of the brain that manage the bladder region and the pelvic floor. So to start off with the changes at the bladder, we know that when you've had some kind of threat or trauma to the area, and that could be an infection, an inflammation, it can be any type of trauma, and actually, to be honest, it can be any kind of emotional trauma as well. So the body has to register a threat, and there has to have been some kind of precursor, which might mean that you may have had many bouts of thrush regularly or repetitively, or you might have had a couple of urine infections previously that hadn't really been got rid of, or you had them a few times in a row. Either which way, that area downstairs has been sensitised. Now, there are other reasons why that area might be sensitised when people undergo traumas that are particularly horrible, and we're not really going to go into those things, but know that particularly genital trauma or anything to do with that area is a reason that you may be more hypersensitised and more likely to get bladder pain syndrome. So we start off with this trauma. The bladder region will respond to that trauma and that threat in an appropriate way. It will create inflammation. The nerve endings and the layer and the lining of the bladder will become hypersensitised to watch out for more threats, looking for bears that are going to attack it. Are there any bears in my bladder? And that hypersensitivity is normal, and that's good. That's what should happen when we're attacked and we're threatened. So we get inflammation and hypersensitivity at the level of the bladder, the lining of the bladder. But then also this, the pelvic floor around it will to some degree go into a little bit of tension, and that's to protect the area initially. But what that does is it reduces the blood flow and the neural and electrical activity within the pelvic floor. So long term it isn't very good. It's a bit like gripping your fist and holding that fist tight for a long period of time. You'll find that your hand, if you do this for a very short period of time, becomes white because it loses, the blood is not able to pump around it so well. Okay, so we get some tension downstairs and we get some inflammation and some hypersensitivity, which are very normal key things that happen in any response to a threat. But for whatever reason, and we don't quite understand it yet, that threat state becomes perpetual. So your body goes into this chronic state where it feels like it has to fight what's going on downstairs all the time, and it keeps fighting. So it's doing a really, really good, beautiful thing of fighting the infection, or whatever threat it feels is there, but it's doing it for too long, and it kind of forgets to chill out. It forgets to relax and go back to its normal resting state where everything's okay. And that means that if it's really hypersensitive, you're gonna be more aware when your bladder is filling. You're going to really feel that stretch, and it may be that instead of being able to stretch for a long normal duration, so overnight being able to have 450 to 600 mils or even more in your bladder, you might find that you wake after 250 mils or 300 mils needing a wee desperately, because instead of it just feeling like your bladder is filling up, it's feeling like, oh, I need to go right now. It's really, really extreme, like it would be after your bladder filled to 800 mils. So those levels have completely changed, and that continues. So that's the level of the bladder and downstairs. What we also know is that we get changes in the brain, because when you are in pain for any length of time, over what we call a normal kind of acute period, and the timescales on this vary, but I've read 6 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 months, but we're going to say a shortish period of time. But if it's longer than we'd expect it to be, that you're still in pain, the brain does some really clever things to keep fighting your bears. And so it changes some of the structures, the ways that bits of the brain talk to each other become heightened, become more likely to fire and talk to each other in different ways. So you end up, your brain makes you more aware, you pay more attention to how your bladder's feeling. you become more aware and more likely to feel like you're urgent or you need the toilet more, and your pelvic floor, structurally, your brain will cause your pelvic floor to go into a bit of tension. Now, so when we're dealing with bladder pain syndrome, what we've got to do is treat these structural problems here, which are not of your creation. It's not something that you can go, I'm going to change my salience network and make me more aware of my bladder today. It's not something that you've chosen to do. It's a really beautiful, complex mechanism that we call plasticity, where the brain has gone, wait, I'm doing this all the time. I've got to look after my bladder. Right, I'm going to get better at looking after my bladder. And it changes how it functions to be able to achieve that. Now, when we're treating bladder pain syndrome, yes, we need to treat the bladder. We need to look at that hypersensitivity. We also need to treat the pelvic floor, because we know that if the pelvic floor remains tender or painful on touch, sex, passing water, anything else, it will give you those same symptoms. Your bladder symptoms will not go away. But we also need to treat this. And that's what physio aims to do, a bottom-up and a top-down approach, a holistic approach, a truest sense of the word of holism, the whole body. We need to treat from the top down and the bottom up. And the good thing to know is this is the same for all types of pelvic pain. So we have very good evidence to show that this is the approach that we need to use in all pelvic pains, in vulvodynia, in vaginismus, dyspareunia. We need to be looking at what's happening in the tissues, but also what's happening in our brain and how it understands and it decides what is under threat and what isn't, and what to pay attention to and how to respond to signals coming into our body. So I hope that's made it a bit clearer. If you've got any more questions and want any more clarity on this, then just let me know and I'll do another couple of videos. But when you're thinking of bladder pain syndrome, you've got to think about more than the bladder, because a lot of the bladder symptoms are happening because the brain is made a decision that your bladder remains under threat, and it will give you symptoms that aren't necessarily anything to do with what is actually happening downstairs. Hi, while I've got you here for a second, if you're a physio or a physical therapist interested in learning more about what I'm talking about, how we holistically manage someone in pelvic pain with a much better idea of how to apply the best of pain science in the clinic, then my Happy Bladder course, which is based on bladder pain but is really much more of a holistic view of how we treat all pain states in the pelvis. I'm working really hard to get that up online for everyone, hopefully early 2020, so the beginning of next year. So check back on the website, keep your eyes peeled on my social media, and if you're interested, the course should be going live early next year. Thanks.